So welcome everyone. Welcome to a HUG, a Houdini user group. This is basically like organized around the world by side effects based on like the country or the city they live in. So this is like a Belgium Houdini user group. This is actually like the second one in Belgium. The first one was during COVID, which was online. This is actually the first in-person Houdini user group in Belgium here. So thanks everyone here for coming out to do this event in person. That's awesome. Also, I want to thank Side Effects as well for, of course, helping and sponsoring the event, and as well HOWEST and DIE for helping us with the location here as well. So without further ado, I'm going to start off a small presentation for this evening, and after that we can just have a chat, some beers with each other, and just having the Houdini community together here in Belgium. So what I want to talk about is procedural buildings. Specifically here, I recently made like a fan art Overwatch scene, and just want to like talk a bit about that, break that down on how I made that. So just some like workflows and showing off some details and maybe some tips and tricks for you. In case you don't know me, I'm Simon Verstraete. I worked with Side Effects. I recently changed to Studio Gobo, where I'm a senior tech artist there. But I've been making tutorials for a while. Some of you might have seen of them, especially if they are related to like games. I made a few of them there. But yeah, let's talk a bit about building tools. So first, quick video of this. So this is the scene that I built using Houdini and Unreal, of course, all real time. Just a small scene based on some of the Overwatch scenes that you see, and this is like an example of the building generator, just some like very basic buildings that I can make, and then I can place them in a scene, scatter them around, generate new versions, and so on. So it's not like the most complicated building generator out there, of course, but it's just going to show you some of the basic things that you can do, and maybe there are some couple tips and tricks that you might find interesting. So what I'm going to talk about today, a quick overview of that. So when you make a project, of course, you want to start off with some references. So gathering the idea of like, what do I actually want to build? Is there already out there something that looks close to it? Like, what are some ideas there that I can build and try? Then the overall structure of the tool. Like, how does this tool actually work? How do we generate a building? What are some of the actual bare bones of the structure of a building tool, or specifically the one that I'm going to build? Then once I have a building, what could be like asset placement? How do we place a door or a window? Talking a little bit about that as well. And then to finish off, I want to talk about UVs, because in games we often do something more specific where we want to have lighting textures, things like that. So I'm going to talk a bit about that as well, and trying to do that in a procedural way, because we all know like doing UVs manually is a pain. So trying to do a procedural approach to some of the UV and unwrapping. So first of all, references. When you make a project, of course, you want to try to get some inspiration, try to get references to what are you building. In my case, I'm building a fan art scene. So basically, I can just play the game and just grab screenshots. So played Overwatch 2. You probably have played it as well, probably. And then you can just take some screenshots and look in 3D how they're building, like where do they spend poly counts? Are they like particularly something special with like textures, or how does a building look? Where do they spend their budget and so on? Like trying to see in the game how it's built, basically. You can also like go to artists' portfolio who actually worked on the scene, of course, because they often include like nice beauty shots of like the things that they're building. So if you want to just see how they're built, so this is from Tiago. Great shots as well. In some rare cases, people will actually include some more like breakdowns or other elements on how like modular sets are built. Of course, in this case, there wasn't like any full details on how they build it, but there was many of these beauty shots. But sometimes you might find some interesting things as well on portfolios of people. Now, once we have these references, you're also going to have to analyze them. So no big surprise there. Specifically here, it's quite simple in geometry. If you look at some of these geometries, like if you look at the pillar, it's like quite simple. You can basically say it's a box, and then the detail is basically faked in like the normal map, for example. Also on top of the building, like they slightly bend the shape. So again, geometry-wise, not super complicated. So we're going to try to look at this in a way like, what do I need to generate procedurally in Houdini? What are the geometries that I actually need to build procedurally in Houdini? But you can mainly see like it's quite simple, I would say, and a lot of the detail comes in like textures, normal maps, materials, baking edges, baking highlights, things like that, which I will talk about a little bit as well. Another thing as well to analyze, for example, could be like the modularity of the assets, like what windows do they use, what doors do they use, how many times do they use certain props, like trying to see that repetition, especially in games. They often like reuse things, of course. So I can like get a grasp of this, and maybe for my own project, then I only have to build in 3 different windows, for example. I don't have to make a big amount, or I don't have to spend the time to do a procedural window or building generator. Now, there are many other ways of like references. So I know that I was making like a fan art scene. So of course, like playing the game, looking at how things are built. But what about like other references, like Houdini references? I know that I want to make a building generator. So you could think about like maybe I get references there as well. So there are many different like references. Of course, you can have lightning references, material references, and so on. You can like infinitely like gather a bunch of things. But in here, like I'm doing a fan art. So a lot of things are already like controlled as output. Like my final output should look like it's made from Overwatch, but the Houdini side is something that where I have full control, and so I can basically have the freedom to build something without much difference there. So already like looking at building tools itself, it's very popular in Houdini, of course. Building tools have been out there for ages, basically. It's nothing super revolutionary. So just here I Googled building tool or building generator, something along those lines. You see a bunch of different building tools. Now, when looking at building tools, you have different styles of buildings, but also different projects. Like each project, you might want to have different ways of building a tool. Sometimes you want to do like full instancing of models. Sometimes you want to make some unique geometry and so on. So there are many different ways on how to build building tools, and it's just interesting to maybe have like a browse and see what's out there. What is out there? Does everyone do like instancing, or maybe some people do like unique geometries? What could be like a good way for my project? That's always often the question as well. And in case like someone would be more newer to Houdini, I can point out to some tutorials as well. So this is from Project Titan that I worked on. So this is a building tool that was used there. So if you're never built a building tool before, you're quite new to Houdini maybe, just like look up some tutorial already, because the knowledge is already there. You don't have to like make these things up or magically find it. You can just go and learn from tutorials as well. Also, the Side Effects Labs team has also made an effort in making multiple building tools as well. So in case you just want to quickly make something, you can just grab the Labs building tool. If you're not familiar with Side Effects Labs, it's basically an additional tool set inside of Houdini that you can use for free. And there is a building tool in there. You can just use it, generate buildings, and you could be happy with it. Or you can even open that building tool, break it down. It might be a big network, so be afraid if you dive in first to this. So there's a lot of interesting stuff in there, but if you want to learn building tools, there's some good learning there. And some more things, post-apocalyptic scene that I made a while ago. This is like a building tool with like overgrown ivy as well, because it's sort of like in that theme. But again, there are so many different ways of building tools, and just some couple like examples if you just want to head into like tutorials and see how things are broken down, just some more references there as well. Now let's talk a bit about the overall structure of how I made the building tool for that fan art scene. My overall idea here is that I basically want to stack cubes on top of each other, and each cube I'm going to take it through a certain iteration process. That's the basic or the main idea. As you can see, like just simple cubes, trying to get then a shape out of those cubes. And this process is basically very useful with like a multi-parameter, of course. So if you're a Houdini user, then you know what a multi-parameter is. You're just going to add a certain number, and it will just create that times you add it to that number. So in this case, we have one floor. We can see we have one tab with our parameters. And if you would, for example, would change that to another number, then of course we will have more of those floors in our case. So here you can see I have then 3 different tabs open, and each tab I can control the different floor size or height and so on. So multi-parameter is very useful for this. Then how does this look in Houdini, of course? This is basically like one big loop. So again, we just like stacking cubes on each other. For each cube we have, we just take it through a loop, do a certain process, add a door, add a window, add some borders or something like that. Just taking a loop to, just adding a loop to that system. Then here is a very small video of how this tool works. Nothing super special, just like a slider to make this a bit bigger, make the size a bit bigger. You can also do an offset, for example, offsetting the shape in a certain direction. We can also here, for example, remove the sides, so we can go inwards in a shape if we want to like subtract that from the shape, for example. You can also like remove borders. Just as you can see, it's like not the most advanced thing out there. It's just like some basic settings you can do with this tool. You can build this quite quickly from scratch, basically. There are a bunch of controls here. You can, of course, add way more controls. It's always the balance between like finding too much like different sliders and having a compact menu that artists actually will use. So as you can see here, like I can add 4 floors now. I can go back to the 4th floor, make it a bit smaller or bigger, tweak that, play around with that. As you can see, just like simple parameter procedural modeling. And I can also, for example, here go and change the pillar. So I can just enable, disable this, just some basic settings. You can also see that I will have seed placement as well. So just randomly placing these assets. And that's the next thing that I actually want to talk about. So the base system is, again, like just stacking cubes on top of each other, nothing too complicated. And then sort of like adding some additional like modeling on top of it, like the pillars and the borders will make this look better, of course. Now, talking about asset placement. This can be done in a variety of ways. Like how can we place an asset on a building? How do we place a window on a building? There are different ways, and I'm going to describe 2 ways of doing this. One way is just like fully random, basically, which is not always interesting, but it's just random. So maybe in the background, you just want to have like a big cityscape or something. This might be good enough for it because we just want to randomly place things and don't matter too much about having very specific placements. So what I do here is I would just grab one of the cubes, get the bottom primitive, which can be done by the split by normal nodes, if you were interested in that, which just splits your geometry based on the normal of a primitive. Then you will extract the lines of the primitive, like convert lines. Then I will scale those lines a little bit so it doesn't like intersect with like the pillar, for example. And from there, I use the magical node, which is called the chain node, and we're going to chain basically models to a line. So the chain node takes certain assets, certain models, and it will take a line. It will just place them on the line for you. Just very easily to do here. And as you can see, it doesn't necessarily have intersecting with each other. We can even control how far models are apart from each other. You can plug in even more models. You can randomize the placement of these models. Just a useful node. And what you can see here as well is the assets, they are basically represented by the bounds. So what I'm doing here is I'm just making sure that if I put in an asset, I also have the bounds information of the asset. So I used that here. And then I basically subtracted those bounds into just like one instancing point. So I will actually instance my model on the points, and I will just have those models along those lines, basically. You can also add some additional randomness in a chain node or with the labs node called random selection, which will randomly select points. You can delete them. Useful node. So that can be a way to add more randomness as well. That's basically how I roughly did like the random prop placement. So here is a result of that. So just 3 buildings, 3 same like settings, only difference is the seat placement, of course, which you can see we have like different windows and doors and so on. So the chain node plays like the heavy weight here, controlling a lot of it. I can control, again, like the distance between different props. I can even add some more randomness in there if I want to. But like I said, like this is like the random placement method, which is okay, but maybe you want to do something specifically. Maybe you want to target the door specifically at the location. So if you look back at my reference, and what I sort of like end up doing is I wanted a way to like mimic the placements of the original reference. So how can I make sure that if I want a window in the corner, I can actually target that window there? So I simply swapped the random system for manual override, which is basically a point cloud. So I'm going to have points in the air that I can control, and this is basically driving where my models are placed. So the add node is good for this. So the add node is basically placing points in the 3D space for you, and each of them have handles. You can see that each of the points have handles, and I can now drag this around my building, and I define then what happens there. What I also do here is I use the weight value. That's why the arrow is pointing there. So each point has a weight value, and I'm actually leveraging this as my sort of like ID for identifying which asset should be placed. So if my weight value is 1, it's going to be like a small window. If the weight value is 2, it's going to be a large window, and so on and so on. So just this is built in the node, so you don't have to like make up functionality. This is just already added here. Then of course we have these points in like this space, but they're not attached to the building. So we just do like a raycast to our building shape. So they're now sticking to our building. And we also need to, of course, calculate the rotation so you can get the normal direction from the walls into the points. And then we have roughly the orientation on how to, for example, place that window or something. So we have that over there. And this could be the result of like the manual override mode. So again, if I want to target the buildings very specifically where models are placed, I can now just create these point clouds with the add node where I specifically want things here and there. As you can see, I can just make something that looks closer to a reference or to what I have in mind. So the buildings that are in front of the scene are made this way, where I fully control roughly what is going on, and the buildings in the background, where I don't mind too much randomness, I just randomly generated some buildings and placed them over there. So it's great to just have these options, of course, because you want to control how things are going. So this was a very quick way on implementing this, because you can literally switch the random points and switch it for the add points, which is not that much work to add in the tool. Now, one thing I've not talked about is you have now these assets, you know where they are, but we need to combine them with the actual walls, of course. So I'm going to do a Boolean, a subtraction of the shapes. So I'm going to take my assets, I'm going to calculate the bounds of these assets again, and I'm going to just Boolean that out of the walls. We actually have room or a cutout for the placement of a certain window or a door or something like that. So it will look like this. So as you can see, I have now room and no intersection where my walls and my windows and so on will meet. It just nicely will attach directly there. Then I'm going to talk about the last part, which is the UV part. So like I said, like doing UV manually, of course, like is tedious, takes a lot of work. So what can we do to make this a bit more procedurally? There are some nice Houdini options there. It's not perfect, but you can probably get quite far with some of these options. So first, let's keep it simple. Like, what is a simple shape to unwrap, for example, which is the walls. The walls could look like this. Before the subtraction of the assets, we can already do like a pre-UV step, so we don't have to worry about the shape when it gets like intersected with assets. So a node for this is called auto seams. So if you want to calculate the seams of an object, you can use the auto seams node. It's a quite useful node, but it doesn't work well in like very complicated geometry. In this case, it's literally like a cube with like a bevel on it. So it's not the most complicated geometry, and it will give you relatively good results in seaming that. Now, using those seams from the auto seams node, plug it into the UV flatten node, you will get something like this. So looks okay, looks roughly what I expected. Can be, of course, a little bit better by enabling the rectify feature. This is actually built in the flatten node if you've not used it before. If you look in the flatten node, there are actually like some slots and options to rectify the shape. So we'll just like make sure it's like fully straight and cleaned up, which is very useful, of course, because you want to make sure you can count on those UVs. And again, this works pretty well here because my shape is quite simple. If you go into like very complicated shapes, you might see that it might struggle sometimes. But in this case, since we are making like a hard surface building things, usually it's great. So looking back at our building here, we can see if we just look at the walls, the UVs on that are okay. I mean, it's not the most complicated thing to unwrap, of course. So the UVs are good. They're just like, have a nice UV space, nice tileable. Of course, if I quickly go back, I'm of course like scaling and normalizing the UV until it like takes uses the space and also fits nicely with the tiling texture as well. But one other question is then still here is how do we do all the other things of the building? How do I do the pillar? How do I do the border? How do I do some of these assets? And that's basically coming down to using trim sheets. So for all the other props that you see here is basically all using trim sheets to make sure it like looks nice without having to like bake down into like unique textures. So a trim sheet could look like this. If you're not familiar with it, it's very common in games. So it's just basically like a bunch of strokes, and we're going to take our UVs and place them on the strokes to sort of like have the normal detail or the texture detail that holds in the trim sheet. This is super, super simplified, of course, this trim sheet. There are way more interesting and complicated trim sheets that have more detail. So again, what you would normally do is you would take one of the strokes, put it, for example, on the pillar, and then you have the result all the way on the right. So the actual mesh I mentioned in the beginning as well is like our geometry will be very simple. It can be basically a box, and all the chamfering detail, like you feel like there is like beveling going on, is basically from the trim sheet and the normal map. You can see some like artifacts on the pillar, on the side of the pillar, which you can also actually see in Overwatch themselves, because they used probably like very similar IDs here, because they want to keep the poly count low enough. Because Overwatch is also multiple platforms, so they want to make sure that they don't go crazy in like poly counts and so on. Now, the question is still like, how do we do this trim sheet technique? How can we do this in a procedural way as well? So let's take this model as example. So this is a hard surface, a bit more complicated model. It has like a bunch of like different things going on. So how can we go from a space where I manually would take a UV and place it on the trim sheet, which is of course very repeating steps. How can we do a certain logic where we can measure the UV space and put it automatically where it should fit on the trim sheet? So here we have this model. And again, first step before we do anything with the trim sheets is we just need to figure out how to unwrap this. In this case, since it's just like a hard surface model, nothing too detailed, I can basically use the group node with angle searching feature. So just calculate the angles, edge angle, and this is the result basically. Just the group node calculating the angle here. Then again, we're going to use the UV flatten here. We're going to use those group seams into our flatten node, and it will just like flat those UV shapes. Also rectifying this as well. I'm not going to say that this is like 100% perfect UV, but a lot of it also is based on the fact that we need to do a certain UV auto seaming step, which in this case is just based by angle, which in some cases might not perfectly work and needs maybe like a manual touch. But in this case, it's roughly okay for like first steps. Then comes here the magic, which is the labs trim sheet node. So you can try building your own system to like magically map UVs to a certain space, but basically it's already built here in the labs node, which is called the labs trim sheet node. So quickly, how would this work is you would basically actually make the primitives of your trim sheet. So here's my trim sheet in the middle, and I, for example, made the first 3 strokes of the trim sheet into actual primitives. And then you use the utility node to actually sort of like utilize these shapes and give it like attributes to work with like the other nodes coming downstream. So here, if we then place the automatic trim sheet node, we basically plug in our 3D model and we plug in that trim sheet that we made, those 3 strokes that I made, and we plug it in over here, and then it will basically do the work for you. Like this is where the actual logic happens, where our UV will be matched into certain spots. There are a bunch of like settings and sliders you can tweak, but by default, it will roughly like do at least something with the UV space. And this is actually the full setup. So we have like I said, we need to first like calculate our seams. Like this is where my model comes in. Calculating where are the seams of my model can be done by auto seam node or a group node based on angle, something like that. You can manually select seams if you want to. And then of course we need to then flatten that. So UV flatten nodes. So using the seams, flattening the result. And of course, rectifying here as well, because if you rectify your UVs, it will also work better, of course, in the trim sheet logic as well. And then finally, we have then our trim sheet nodes. So utilizing what is actually my trim sheet, where is the space that I would like to see the details. So making sure that if your trim sheet is detailed enough, you need to, of course, add that in Houdini as well to make that readable. And then the final node is there at the bottom to sort of like actually do the calculation. So the node setup here is I kept it to like a minimum, which is here like 4 nodes. So this is actually pretty fast to do or implement or just to try. I mean, having an artist doing this manually would take 10 times more longer. This is then the result of the output. So as you can see, like on the edges, we have like these normal details that when we bring this in game, it will look like it's been around. I'm not going to claim that it's like perfect or something like that, but the fact that I basically created a network of 4 nodes and I got this already is already like quite useful to just automatically almost have this. There are some things to tweak and to play around with here. But again, a lot of it also is based on our initial seaming and UV step. So this is still like if your UV step is not perfect enough, you will also, of course, see this in the trim sheet node because it will just place your UV. So if your UV is not good enough, the final result will also be lacking there as well. And that was basically it here for my presentation. So we are ready now to have some drinks, but of course, if there are any questions, feel free to ask some questions. And as well, if you've not seen it, I've actually made tutorials as well, so you can look up Simon Houdini. There's some more learning information there as well. You can also go to the SideFX website for learning as well. I've also added my tutorials there as well. So yeah, thank you. Yes, question. Yeah, so if I quickly come back. So the question was like, did I model this manually? I would say yes, I roughly modeled it in Houdini. If you look at like the wireframes, or I have it here, like if you look at the wireframe, it's like pretty basic. It's nothing super complicated. So yeah. Yeah, this is actually just modeled in Houdini. Just more, I would say like a Boolean workflow. I would use just making a box, bevel it, do a Boolean through it, and have shapes like that. Yes?
When you make a tool for someone else, you like to give the user as much control as they want, or do you like limit them, for example, use the offset on the second floor, for example? Can they go as far as have the second floor be completely off the other building, or do you like to limit it so they can't actually move the building off of it?
Yeah, I mean the tool I showed you today. I mean it's like a basic tool. It doesn't necessarily be perfect, but definitely if it's a tool for production, you would definitely think about those facts. That what if you do a certain slider or parameter value that maybe goes beyond what you expect? It's definitely to think about like either you clamp it inside of the Houdini logic, or maybe your logic maybe does something differently. Like maybe in this case, if I move a house maybe too far, like the second floor goes too far, maybe certainly I place like supporting beams or something like that, because I can actually calculate that if they're not connected anymore, maybe I just switch to like different logic to add supporting structures, so I don't have like flying floors and so on. But that's definitely like something that I've think about in this tool as well, is I could take this further by adding all the smaller details about what if this happens, then your logic should apply to maybe adding support structures or doing this or doing that. But definitely like in a production environment, you like the tool that I made today, like this is like the first pass, for example, of a tool. Like give it out to the team, see if they like it, what do they like, what do they don't like, maybe even like remove some of the parameter sliders, because that's always a thing to like, you can make a tool, but will the artist actually use the tool is also another question often as well. Any other questions? Okay, thank you.